And with the Democratic Party in disarray and the left unable to organize itself into a coherent political movement against Trump, it's a good time for Americans who oppose capitalism to get back to the basics of anti-capitalist politics. Yes, communism. Communism is an economic and political system under which everyone lives equally and has equal access to goods, services, and power. Socialism is a system that precedes communism, in which the value added by labor is transferred over time from the ruling class elites who currently control it under capitalism to the working class that actually produces it. 40% of American voters consistently tell the pollsters, and people will say, which pollsters? It's Gallup, that they have a favorable view of socialism. We appear to be in a classic Marxist final crisis of late capitalism, overproduction, yet the media and education systems don't permit serious discussion of alternatives to capitalism. What exactly is communism? Is it something that we want? Is it even attainable? Can revolution ever be achieved nonviolently? Many, many questions to talk about in this explainer episode of the TMI show. Joining us to help break it down is Caleb Maupin. He's a highly acclaimed speaker, writer, journalist, and political analyst. He's traveled extensively in the Middle East and Latin America. He was involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement from its early planning stages and has been involved in many struggles for social justice. He's an outspoken advocate for international friendship and cooperation, as well as 21st century socialism, and the founder and ideological leader of the Center for Political Innovation. Caleb, thanks for joining us here on the TMI show.
Hi, how's everybody doing?
Nice
Pretty
to
good.
see you. I'm going to pop in our producer too, producer Robbie, because I know he's got lots of questions. And also I'm going to need him to kind of take over for a couple minutes because I might need to run to the bathroom. TMI.
The WC, as it were.
Talk about TMI. Okay, I'm going to remove myself for a second. If you
I hope it all comes out okay.
Yes, thanks.
Not all, just some.
Yep.
All right, so Caleb, thanks for joining us. We're very excited here on the show. Robbie, who leans, I think it's fair to say, to the far right, and I have found that in discussing about economic nationalism, for example, that we have that there's a Venn diagram sometimes between those of us like me who are socialists who definitely I'm self-described communist, and himself. And so we thought, Robbie had brought up the idea that we should have an explainer episode because a lot of Americans don't really learn about communism or socialism in school, except in the context of the Cold War, the Red Threat, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, maybe if you're lucky. But nobody really talks about what it is and whether it's something that, we could possibly do here in the US. So, what's your, I guess, how would you define, if, to make it as simple as possible, how would you define socialism and communism?
Well, communism is a world with so much wealth and so much abundance that the very need for a government fades away, that there's pretty much equality because everyone's got enough and more than enough, and there's enough to go around for everybody. And it is a world in which people only have to work because they feel like working. They want to entertain themselves, which technology has advanced greatly. It's a world of vast abundance beyond really what we can imagine. The road to such a world is rational planning of the economy, the means of production, the banks and the factories and the industries being organized to serve public good rather than simply the profits of a wealthy few. And socialism has come into the world largely as a struggle against what we live under now, which is the monopolistic capitalist imperialist system, where big corporations dominate the world. And the main way they dominate the world and keep themselves in power and keep the profits rolling in is by keeping the world poor and holding back economic development. Big monopolies, big bankers dominate the world and keep the world poor so that they can stay rich, and they keep countries in poverty. And starting with the Russian Revolution, continue with the Chinese Revolution, and there's been a whole wave of revolutions around the world against colonialism and imperialism, where countries have broken out of that system and begun the course of development. And China today is the second largest economy in the world, 800 million people lifted out of poverty. That, you know, with rational planning of the economy, you can raise productive forces, and the idea is to create a world of vast wealth and abundance, in which poverty and inequality can be eliminated. I will say that in our times, the woke left and communism get equated with each other constantly. And as somebody who's been to many communist countries, many international communist gatherings and all of that, the idea that China is doing the woke thing is absurd. The idea that, you know, you go to Venezuela, you go to Nicaragua, you go to the countries that are, you know, largely, you know, following the Marxist ideology and building an anti-imperialist society. The idea that they have something in common with the, you know, the Rachel Maddow fan club is just absurd. And it's gotten to the point where I'm starting to describe myself more as an innovationist rather than a socialist or a communist, because my views haven't changed. I'm an anti-imperialist. I'm an advocate of a socialist planned economy. However, I just, you know, I look at the woke people. They don't believe in economic growth. They believe in degrowth. They worship poverty. And we've also learned that one of the biggest mistakes is you cannot create equality in poverty. The road
what do you mean by they
equality.
worship? Can you extrapolate a little bit on when you say that they worship poverty?
Well, you know, poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. That was said by Deng Xiaoping, the founder of the leader of modern China right after Mao's death, and that there was an attempt to create socialism in poverty. In many of these communist countries, they had their revolution, they were isolated and cut off from the world economy. So they tried to say, okay, we're very poor, but we're going to be very, very equal in poverty. And that was a disaster.
Cambodia under Pol Pot, Kampuchea.
Yeah, and those, you know, Pol Pot, the Cultural Revolution in China, even some of Che Guevara's economic policies in the early years of the Cuban Revolution were disastrous. You can't create equality in poverty. The road to equality is economic development and abundance, but you need rational planning of the economy to get that kind of abundance, right?
Would you say that, Caleb, that it's, sorry to interrupt, but would you say it's fair to say that, as you know, my interpretation of Marx is that socialism, and I agree with your analysis so far, required the capitalist development first, right? Like that, like Mao's contribution was to say, not necessarily, you know, Mao starting out with an agrarian model, but the traditional European, Western European look at communism was, of socialism was, you have to start with the capitalist development and mechanization and industrialization that builds the wealth that can then be aggregated and redistributed, right?
Well, I mean, the capitalist economy of the world was a great advance over feudalism, and no one questions that. In feudalism, you didn't have electricity, you didn't have running water, you didn't have a lot of the great advances, and that you needed
Although
capitalism.
they only worked like 3 hours a day, though, on average. So
well, yeah, I mean, you needed capitalism to unleash the productive forces to the point that we could eventually develop a modern socialist economy. However, capitalism moved into its stage of imperialism, monopolistic capitalism, and it kept countries across the developing world in Africa, Asia, Latin America, kept them in chronic poverty where they couldn't develop. And so in order to have independent economic development, in order to build up their economies, they had to break free and establish kind of a planned economy. I mean, imperialism is the British Empire going to India and burning all the looms and forcing them to import their cloth from Britain. Imperialism is NAFTA. The people in Mexico have been growing their own food for, you know, since before Christopher Columbus showed up. But then NAFTA came in, and now American agribusiness dominates Mexico, and that these countries
trademarking seeds that used to just be there.
Yeah, and that countries have been kept in poverty, have been kept under the domination of foreign corporations, have been unable to develop. Their resources maybe get stripped away by foreign corporations, but they don't get to develop. And that it requires kind of an anti-colonial revolution for these countries to even start on the basic road of industrialization. Prior to 2011 and the war, the country with the highest life expectancy on the African continent was Libya, where Gaddafi had led an anti-colonial revolution and built a socialist economy. And they built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River. They wiped out illiteracy. They had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. They'd had great achievements because they had broken out of imperialism and begun the course of independent development. So that's what you could talk about when you talk about socialism. It's, in China, they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. And there's a market sector, a very big market sector. A lot of people have become millionaires or billionaires. But at the end of the day, they have 5-year economic plans where you have a government that comes out of this anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolution that plans out the economy to make sure that growth continues, to oversee and plan economic growth. And I eventually believe that in the United States, we're going to need something similar. I've raised the slogan, we need a government of action that will fight for working families. And ultimately, if we're going to have growth and prosperity in America again, we're going to need a government that breaks the power of the big monopolies and, and steps on Jeff Bezos and steps on the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the DuPonts and organizes the economy to once again have growth. And I think socialism in America would involve empowering small business owners, would involve rebuilding the infrastructure that's decaying across America and putting our oil and gas under public ownership so the wealth of our natural resources goes back into our economy and goes back into the communities of the United States, a national bank that would strategically lend money and in the interest of an overall economic plan to rebuild the country. And that ultimately the idea is getting beyond a system where profits are in command. Capitalism is, I think Marx talked about preliminary transformation into capital, meaning that, that people just do things to make money. The economy just functions to maximize profit for private owners. Profits are in command. Well, getting beyond that and having an economy where the state is actively planning to make sure that wealth and prosperity are growing and to ensure that
a good example
continues.
For Robbie, I would say, a good example of that was in the Soviet Union, where they tried to design cars that would last as long as possible, because the idea was to put a car in every driveway, not to sell you a new car every year, would be an example.